So I want to express solidarity with the powerful social movement in Iran led by women, which has erupted since the state murder of 22-year-old Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini. Iran Human Rights puts the death toll at 133 since the state started trying to violently repress this movement. More than 1,500 have been arrested. But still this movement grows, and the slogan, woman, life, freedom, echoes from one corner of Iran to another. Mahsa was murdered by Iran's notorious morality police, who took her into custody, accusing her of violating the super-strict hijab dress code. She died from cardiac arrest after suffering a head injury and undergoing a 3-day coma. The killing of Mahsa was not an accident. Her murder is a continuation of the systematic, misogynistic and repressive policies of Islamic capitalism. My question to the Minister: what further action do you now intend to take to show this country's revulsion at the actions of the regime in Tehran?
Deputy John Brady.
And first and foremost, I want to express my sympathy and that of my party with the family and friends of Mahsa Amini, who was killed in detention following her arrest, and the subsequent crackdown on protesters. And it has to be said, this is not the first time the Iranian authorities have cracked down on protests such as this. Reports estimate that between 63 and 133 people, civilians, innocent civilians, have been murdered in this crackdown, with over 1,500 people arrested. There needs to be an immediate independent investigation. Certainly I have no faith in the Iranian authorities to investigate themselves, and that is something that the Irish Government need to pressure to ensure that there is an independent investigation. I also want to reiterate the point that the Iranian ambassador must be summoned to express our horror and grave concerns with regard to the crackdown on the rights of women within Iran.
Minister to reply.
Yeah, no, I share the concern of deputies in relation to this issue, and our voice needs to be heard in relation to it in terms of condemnation and criticism. And of course, we have to work with you and with our EU colleagues as well in terms of being part of a collective EU response. Can I say, in terms of the Iranian ambassador, my department continues to closely monitor developments in Iran through our charge d'affaires in Tehran. I raised the case of Ms. Amini's death and the Iranian authorities' response to protests directly with my Iranian counterpart in New York, as I said already, just a few weeks ago. And senior officials in my department are in ongoing contact with the Iranian ambassador, and the Iranian authorities are fully aware of our concerns. These issues are also getting a lot more discussion now within the EU, that obviously is looking at how we can collectively respond to putting pressure on Iran to end the brutal crackdown of legitimate and in most cases peaceful protest. We're talking about schoolgirls here. We're talking about students, women, and indeed men, who are outraged by a young woman losing her life in custody, having been beaten up, and that has sparked something in Iran, which has spread outside of Iran too, in terms of calls for change. And the outrage that has come with that. So I think we have to obviously monitor how this progresses, but Ireland needs to be very clear in terms of what we expect and what we ask for in terms of consistency with international law and a respect for women's rights.
The deputies have said, the Iranian authorities have also introduced restrictions with regard to free and uncensored internet access, as well as WhatsApp and Instagram. So again, the fundamental right to freedom of expression is being breached in this case. So there's two fundamental rights being breached: the right to assemble and protest and the right to freedom of expression. So you mentioned, Minister, in relation to our EU colleagues, I'm just wondering what can be done at EU level to highlight this particular case, to highlight these events and to highlight the situation in Iran generally. Are we talking about the EU issuing a statement, or going further than that, perhaps some sort of sanctions or whatever? And no doubt it has to fit into the overall geopolitical situation in that region. So I'd be interested to know what you propose to do, or what you can propose at EU level to highlight these circumstances.
And Minister, again, I just want to reiterate, I accept fully that you met with the Foreign Affairs counterparts in New York. But in a previous discussion with Deputy Brady, you also highlighted the fact that we have ambassadors here in order to keep diplomatic channels open. I think it now warrants summoning Ambassador Islami from the Iranian Republic to your office and admonishing him in person. I think that's certainly something that the Irish people would expect.
Mick Barry.
Minister, several solidarity protests have been organised here in this state since the murder of Mahsa. The Iranian community have been the key driver of these protests, which have been supported by other groups, such as students at Trinity College and the socialist feminist group Rosa. These actions should, however, at the very least, be matched by the actions of the state. Now, I hear the point you're making. You met your Iranian counterpart at the United Nations on September 21st, and your department is monitoring the situation in Iran. But how much more needs to happen? How many more people need to be killed before you take action to summons the Iranian ambassador into Ivy House to let the views be known on this, and to symbolise Irish opposition to Iranian state murder and Irish support for the Woman Life Freedom Revolt?
John Brady.
Minister, it is right that we fully support the right of the Iranian people, to particularly women, to protest against what are draconian measures and treatment by Iran. And I want to raise serious concerns about the Iranian response to this crackdown and the protest, blaming the West and totally ignoring their own responsibilities, and crack down on protesters and the shameful treatment of women. So again, to reiterate my support to the protesters, condemn the brutal crackdown on the protesters. Now, Minister, we're due to open an embassy in Iran next year, and I support that and I welcome that. It is something that is needed, and I support our approach towards diplomacy. But it is right that on one hand you call in the Russian ambassador to give him a dress down with regard to the brutal illegal occupation of Ukraine, and a similar approach must be taken with the Iranian ambassador. He needs to be called in, he needs to be summoned to express our shock, horror and grave concerns with regard to treatment, particularly of Iranian women.
Minister to conclude.
Deputies, I hear what you're asking in relation to the Iranian ambassador. Trust me, the Iranian ambassador knows exactly our views on this issue. One of the differences between Iran and Russia is that I have had a number of conversations with my Iranian counterpart, because Ireland has a specific role in the Security Council in relation to trying to re-establish the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, which is linked to sanctions and so on. And I suspect I'll be speaking to my Iranian counterpart in the near future. So I will have a direct opportunity to raise our concerns, the concerns of this House, directly with the Iranian Foreign Minister, which is a much more powerful tool in some ways than raising it with an ambassador. But trust me, the ambassador will also be very clear in terms of our concerns and the perspective of this House, and I suspect is listening to this debate as well. So just to reassure you on that. In relation to what we can do at an EU level, there have been, just to give you a sense of what is Ireland's view on Iran and sanctions. Sanctions are an important tool of foreign policy used to deter states from pursuing actions which threaten either international stability or from harming citizens in their own country, including through human rights abuses. Since 2011, the EU has applied sanctions against individuals and entities complicit or responsible for directing or implementing grave human rights violations in Iran. Ireland works with our partners in the EU to ensure that all sanctions regimes are targeted and contain clear exemptions for humanitarian actors. The list is regularly reviewed and updated, and in light of recent protests, the EU is considering a range of responses, including expanding its targeted sanctions against those who violate human rights. So there's a conversation going on about how we could be impactful in terms of targeted sanctions in response to the concerns that clearly the EU and Ireland has in terms of what's going on in Iran today.